Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American Republic?
Hello everybody. Back in 2022, we did a show with an English psychologist, Daniel Pick, on brainwashed, what was then a new history, or his history of thought control. He has a very intriguing book out, Brainwashed, a new history of thought control, which was how our brains got taken over by foreign bodies. 3 years later, and we have another Daniel from London, another expert on the brain, on the mind, Daniel Yon. He's a psychologist and neuroscientist. He teaches at Birkbeck College. And he has a new book out, very intriguing one. It's called A Trick of the Mind, How the Brain Invents Your Reality. Daniel is joining us from his office in Birkbeck. Daniel, is the brain so sophisticated that it invents even how we think about our own minds?
In brief, yes. I think that the key idea I try to put forward in this new book is that the new way we should think about your brain is that your brain is like a scientist. It's kind of making up theories to make sense of the world, other people, and yourself. And so in that sense, one of the main tasks your brain has is to work out who you are and what do you think.
Perhaps it's not so coincidental then, Daniel, that we're all a bit paranoid these days about the creation of smart machines, of AI that is supposedly more intelligent than us. Are you suggesting in an odd kind of way in your new book that the brain is a form of AI?
There's definitely a deep similarity, I think, between the way that lots of modern AI works and what I think modern neuroscience is telling us about how our brains work. So I think there's a sort of deep similarity and a deep dissimilarity. I think the similarity comes from the idea that just like the machines, how we make sense of our world is we take the information that the world provides us, we digest it into models, and we use those models to predict what's going to happen next. I think that's at the heart of lots of the very sort of glitzy AI models that people will be familiar with nowadays. I think a deep difference, though, is that while in the models, those two processes are kind of separate, you have this long period of training a model, and then it's kind of tuned to predict. I think we are in this constant duet with the world around us. We're being trained by our experiences, but we're always taking in new information and incorporating that into the models we use to interpret our surroundings and ourselves.
I like how you put it, constant duet. Sounds rather musical. Is there a musical quality to all this?
I suppose it depends on what you mean. I mean, I think there's an element in which I think all aspects of perception and thought are really a kind of delicate balancing act, in that what you want from your brain really is to be able to take what you know from the routines and systems in the past, but to be responsive to the world as it presents itself to you now. And that requires setting the right balance between different things at different times.
So in this age, Daniel, where we're paranoid about these thinking machines that some people think will acquire their own autonomy, and real scientists like yourself are coming along and telling us that the brain itself is a kind of trick of the mind, that it almost knows what it's doing. It may not be quite alive, but it nonetheless has qualities of life. What does this tell us about us as humans?
Well, I think one of the insights that in some ways you could see it going full circle is that, as you say, there's a kind of life of your brain which is often somewhat hidden from you. So I think it's maybe quite tempting, particularly people in my sort of position, to identify you just as being your brain. But I think in some important way, your brain's doing lots of things, lots of the time, that are not always going to be completely accessible to you as the kind of thinking, feeling subject. But nonetheless, what your brain is doing is creating the world that you live in. So there's something very active about the way that your brain interprets its surroundings. It kind of comes up with its theories and paradigms to make sense of your world. But that process, it doesn't really feel as though it's something that you're directly controlling. In that, when I say that your brain is like a scientist making theories about the world, I don't mean that you sit there sitting back thinking and theorizing, making these kind of conscious predictions. I think it's just part and parcel of how you work, that you have this bundle of predictive machinery unfolding in your head, and that it has a powerful effect in coloring how you experience your world.
Daniel, you don't need me to tell you this, you're a psychologist and a neuroscientist. You teach at Birkbeck, so you're schooled in science. You're not a historian of religion or the history of religious thought. But the more you present the brain in the way you're doing, it sounds to me like a kind of scientific version, a remixed scientific version of how the pre-scientific world thought about a ubiquitous God.
How so?
Well, it knows everything, it somehow controls everything, and yet we can't quite control that. It's part of us and yet not part of us.
Yeah, I think that maybe there could be a sort of similarity, I suppose, in the sense that one thing you might maybe draw out of kind of older religious ideas could be the sense that you need to have the right kinds of perspectives or beliefs or frameworks to make sense of the world. Otherwise, it's a completely senseless place. And I think that, for very good reasons in the Enlightenment, people challenge that idea as just taking beliefs on authority. But I think maybe if you take some of the neuroscience I described in this book seriously, it seems like that kind of process is sort of at the heart of how we think, that we are in the game of coming up with models and beliefs and paradigms and frameworks that give structure to our otherwise structureless world. And there's nothing particularly mystical about that. It's just, in order to make sense of the really ambiguous world we find ourselves in, we need some kind of model. We can't just go from the data alone that our senses provide us with. We need something. And that something is what your brain's in the business of building, that kind of background set of predictions and expectations that give shape to an otherwise very confusing place to live.
As a scientist, Daniel, do you think we're in the latter stages, maybe even the final chapter of our understanding of ourselves? I mean, I guess my question on God and Christianity reveals my own, if not skepticism about science, certainly a belief that the same questions are being addressed by modern scientists have always been addressed throughout our history as a species. Is science the answer, or is it perhaps in a sense part of the problem, or both?
Well, I think it might be a problem if you start to claim that science is the only way you can come to know anything. And I definitely wouldn't be of that point of view. And I think probably my own kind of philosophical perspective puts me in line with people who see kind of the work of philosophy or the work of science as kind of continuous with each other. That there are some questions that they kind of come into the realm of science once we start to have tools like the tools we use here in my lab, or which scientists around the world use to kind of make sense of things. But there might be other questions that require different ways of thinking. I think what's maybe interesting about some of this, I think why I kind of constantly find the world of psychology and neuroscience exciting, is because it seems like what were once questions that it seemed we could only ponder and contemplate in the armchair have become things that we can actually apply new ways of understanding too. But I wouldn't want to say that neuroscience is the only way to understand you and your world, but I think it provides a particularly enlightening perspective that complements other ways that we can understand ourselves and our worlds.
So you don't think in 200, 300, 400 years, maybe in a couple of thousand years, people will be looking back and thinking, oh, those naive neuroscientists like Daniel Yon, they didn't get anything?
Well, they might. I mean, in some sense, I think, when I say that your brain is like a scientist, I do mean that as both an insult and a compliment, because I do think that science is one of the best ways, if not the best way, human beings have come up with to understand the world around us. But the history of science is also a kind of history of failure, right? You could have very intelligent, conscientious people taking careful measurements of the heavens, nonetheless coming up with the theory that the sun revolves around the earth. And so in that respect, I think science is less a body of calcified knowledge that we need to defend against other kinds of knowledge. It's more like a process. It's something that we do, and in so doing, we often throw away old ideas and refine them with new ones. But that's part and parcel of getting nearer and nearer the truth. So in a sense, I think probably I'd be a bit
Nearer the
upset
truth. You're sounding like a scientist. We're
well,
on the way. There is a final destination then, Daniel.
Well,
I mean, we joked earlier on the show, you said you were from Edgware, which is the final stop on the London Northern Line. So there is an Edgware somewhere, right?
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's sort of deeply embedded in my own models of how the universe works.
I got off at Hampstead or Golders Green, so I never think of final stops.
There you go.
In all seriousness, Daniel, where are we in terms of the study of the brain? We've done shows in the past. I think there's I don't remember who said it, but you probably do, the famous quote about the brain being the most sophisticated thing in the universe. And it doesn't even compete with the most sophisticated computer we have. And some of the conversations we've had in the past with neuroscientists like yourself are kind of confessional, where they acknowledge that we're still pretty much ignorant. We're mystified by how the brain works. Is that a fair analysis?
I think it's right that there is still something that, at least from my own personal perspective, I have this sense of awe and wonder about how complex the brain really is, and this sense that each of us can walk around our everyday lives with this thing inside our heads that's kind of roughly got the same physical constituents as a pork chop, but somehow it creates our kind of conscious experiences in every thought and feeling and action and decision we've ever made. So I think there is a deep sense of wonder both from working scientists, but also I would agree that there's lots that we've not been able to test about the brain. And so in some senses, one of the amazing things about modern neuroscience is how much we've learned about human thought and the human condition from the tools we're able to use. I think one of the major challenges that you often have studying particularly the human brain is that the access you have to individual neurons in someone's head is a little bit indirect. You're using these tools that study the brain from the outside in ways that are much less invasive than what's possible if you were to, say, study single cells in animals. And as a consequence, you're kind of looking at the brain from a slight step remove. But even from that kind of slightly distant perspective, we get an idea of what's happening underneath the hood of our own minds. And in some sense, it's almost kind of providential that those tools work, because you could imagine a way that the brain could be formed that wouldn't make it accessible to that kind of study. But nonetheless, people like me can use quite distant measurements of your brain. We can kind of measure the blood flowing through it or the electrical waves that emanate off of it, and nonetheless work out. That can give us an important window into how your thinking and feeling works.
For people who are just listening to this rather than watching, Daniel's sitting in a rather hot house. It looks like a hot house, although his camera isn't working very well. He's got lots of plants behind him. He's in his office or lab at Birkbeck College in London, part of the University of London. What exactly, Daniel, and you mentioned your lab earlier, what exactly do you do in this lab in terms of studying the brain? As you say, it's a tricky thing to do.
So you're right. As you mentioned, I'm the director of the Uncertainty Lab here at Birkbeck, and we're a team who try to understand what are the functions that your mind and brain implement, like what are the processes that unfold inside your head to make that reality you live in possible. So how we kind of do that kind of practical sense is we try to engineer scenarios that can probe different bits of your perception, your belief, and then we try to record your brain activity while you're doing all the things that your mind does. So we might put you inside our brain scanner down in the basement, and we'll try to measure what's happening in your brain when you
Is that,
try
you're part of the University of London. Do you call that Room 101? Or, well, of course, borrowed that from Senate House in London, where I went to university.
No, it's not Room 101, just because I'm sure there are a few people who are very paranoid who we would like to scan, who probably wouldn't go inside the scanner if they clocked onto it being Room 101. But we would put you in the scanner, and we'll measure what's happening in your brain while you perceive something, or while you make a decision, or while you reflect on yourself. And we will track what's happening inside your brain while that's happening, to try and glean clues about what information is processing through your head to make that possible. Once we can do that, we get a sense of how your brain works in miniature, and we can try to connect those processes to what happens in your everyday life. So the ultimate goal would be to try and work out from the contrived situations in the lab where we can measure the fundamental processes of your mind, how can we use that knowledge to then predict how you behave, how you think, and how you feel in the real world around you.
How much do you study reason or rationality? Of course, there's a whole science called behavioral economics, which I've always thought is a bit of a scam. It's just stating the obvious, which suggests we're not always quite as rational as we like to think we are. In terms of your study of the mind and the brain, both in your work in this new book, A Trick of the Mind, and in the work you do at Birkbeck, what does that suggest about both our rationality and our perceived rationality?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because I think maybe particularly from that kind of the long shadow of behavioral economics, there's this sense that people, when they think about their own minds, want to parcel out the rational bits and the biased or irrational bits. And this is, perhaps exemplified best through very kind of popular ways of thinking, like thinking fast and slow, that was popularized by Daniel Kahneman. Of course, yeah. And I think that way of parceling up cognition has real value in kind of cataloging what your mind does and doesn't do. But I think that what I'm trying to achieve in this new book is actually, I think, to dissolve the sense that you have this kind of two-sided nature, that you've got one rational part of your brain doing all the things you're proud of, and this kind of darker part of your psyche that's responsible for everything you get wrong. One of the kind of key conclusions in the book, and what I try to kind of draw out the implications of throughout the different chapters, is that actually it's extremely rational to have certain kinds of biases, in that in many cases it's actually not possible to understand the world you find yourself in without some kind of preconception, some kind of model, some kind of theory. And on the face of it, that can sound deeply irrational to say you need to be biased. But what you can see when you work through the kind of nature of the problems your brain is trying to solve, that you would think maybe rationality is just being in touch with the raw evidence the world gives you. But the evidence the world gives you is basically never enough. It's never enough to just go with the light bouncing into your eyes or the sounds emanating into your ears. You need to have a framework to interpret those signals, to have any chance of perceiving them. And so in that sense, I'm hoping to make us rethink a little bit what rationality entails, and that sometimes the most rational thing you can do is lean on your prior beliefs.
And in terms of leaning on your prior beliefs as humans and scientists, one of the other conversations we've broadcast recently, we've done two actually, with Martin Rees, very distinguished British physicist, astronomer, I'm sure you know his work, and Alan Lightman, who teaches at MIT, a wonderful writer. They have a co-authored book, The Shape of Wonder, How Scientists Think, Work, and Live, although I think it offers a broader question, not just about scientists, but as humans, and this issue of wonder. What does your analysis, Daniel, in both the lab and Trick of the Mind, what does it tell us about wonder? I brought up God earlier, rather unkindly perhaps, but why do we wonder?
Well, I mean,
and how do we wonder? And is the brain the thing that does the wondering, given that we're supposed to have something else which has historically been called a soul?
Well, there's actually a chapter in my book where I try to challenge this. There's a chapter in the book where I try to answer this question, which I actually title Wanderlust. And I try to understand where this drive to kind of understand and contemplate sort of comes from. Because you're right, it seems like something that on the face of it, doesn't fit into the picture that science gives us of what we are as kind of human animals. And part of the reason for that is I think that the sort of psychology and neuroscience of what motivates us, what gets us going, has often focused on these sort of basic drives, like the things we need to stay alive, like sort of basic drives like food or water or sex, things that play this kind of evolutionary function for us. And it's been quite difficult to...
And your whole science, of course, was once controlled by the sex-minded people, wasn't it?
Well, exactly. And I think in some sense, this idea that everything that humans do reduced to these kind of fundamental drives, I think, seems to leave no room for these kind of loftier motives that human beings seem to have. I mean, the kind of example that I tried to draw out in the book is of students who studied under the noses of the secret police in communist Czechoslovakia various works of modern philosophy, and academics from the UK who were smuggled Plato into Prague, basically, and were able to teach.
Famously, there was a whole school of that. I can't remember what it was called, but yeah.
I think they called it the Underground University in the end.
Right,
but the idea being that, you know, that's something that makes no sense if all that behavior of those sort of those students who had this kind of desire to kind of contemplate and to understand, to enrich their own knowledge. It seems really difficult to explain that if you think that all human beings are concerned with is just a preoccupation with trying to stay alive and survive. But what I draw out in the book is actually some of the latest neuroscience suggests that there is a kind of common currency within the brain between some of the kinds of more basic instincts we have and this deeper thirst for knowledge, say. You can see in the circuits of the human brain and also in some animals, the receipt of new information, new knowledge, new understanding has the same currency as literal currency. Your brain kind of treats it as if it has real value. And in that sense, it begins like, I think this is maybe one of those points I was trying to make earlier, that by looking into the brain, we get an insight into an important part of the human condition, which is that there's a feature of our brain that puts our thirst for knowledge sort of on a par with genuine thirst. And so it starts to explain that these drives, they needn't be something that's separate from our biological nature, but some parts of our biological nature can be responsible for some of these particularly powerful human experiences.
Yeah, and I wonder if people accept your argument when they read your book, well, it would make them as humans more or less humble. What would, in terms of their own lives and their interpretation of the human condition, so what would a sort of a classic Darwinian say about your theory of wanderlust, given that our wanderlust is sometimes corroded into wars and fights and sometimes even self-destruction, quite literally? Is your book and your analysis as a neuroscientist, is it in a classical Darwinian sense? Are we still somehow perpetuating are our brains the central operating system, so to speak, in the perpetuation of our own species?
I think that, I mean, everything I say is kind of compatible with the idea that, you know, your brain's evolved and what it's doing is fundamentally in the business of keeping you alive and allowing you to, you know, thrive and survive and multiply. But I think that one of the things that this way of thinking about your mind and your brain might give you is a sense that you can explain some of the maybe biased interactions we find in the modern world without needing to resort necessarily to sort of dark motives. And I think that sometimes a kind of evolutionary psychologist is keen to say, we are prejudiced to outgroups, or we don't like strangers because of some fundamental feature of how our psychology works. Instead, I think if your brain is doing this relatively inert, relatively rational process of trying to make sense of the environment by building models from past experiences, it does mean that we are perhaps prisoners of our own pasts when we try to imagine the future, that we are kind of destined to take our past experiences and have them reflected back to us when we try to understand the present. And that will mean if we are stuck with certain ways of thinking from either our personal lives or from the culture that surrounds us, we're going to have a very, very difficult time suppressing those instincts without finding alternative experiences that will tune up our minds differently.
You talk about us being prisoners of our own past. That sounds more literary than scientific. Freud, of course, was a famous student of literature, of Shakespeare. He was perhaps more interested in literature than he was in science. There are psychologists or scientists like Adam Phillips who suggest that the study of the arts and of literature is as valuable in making sense of our brains and our psychoses as hard science. Where are you on that? Do you think that neuroscientists like yourself should be as well versed in Shakespeare, or perhaps even Freud, who's a form of literature, as the hardcore empirical scientists?
I think so, for sure, because I think that there can be a complementarity to the different perspectives. And I mean, neuroscientists sometimes have this slightly self-aggrandizing phrase they use when they talk about artists, where they call them naive neuroscientists. The idea being that if someone if somebody could write a great novel, or they could, produce a great painting, in some sense they've intuited something about how the brain works, and that explains the success of their artistic practice. I think that's far too imperial for my liking.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we creatives should call guys like you naive writers.
Exactly. But so I think that in some ways, I think what this book, and this is an idea I draw out towards the end, is that I think that it's kind of tempting sometimes to think, as you say, that intellectual life kind of falls into these two cultures, this kind of more kind of empiricist, kind of more scientific type culture, which is focused on things that are objectively measurable. And you might have a perhaps more kind of artistic or more humanist, maybe possibly even more kind of postmodern type culture, which thinks more about the idea that it's not all about objectivity, but it's about the subjective construction of reality. And I think that what this book sort of does is it kind of reveals me to be a sort of intellectual turncoat, in that while I am a scientist, this is the kind of the hard science of how that kind of subjective construction of reality is possible. Because when we look close using the tools of science into how our thoughts unfold, what we discover is that the beliefs and the paradigms that we're committed to, they are shaping how we experience our reality. So I think there's a deep connection between things like literature and art. And in some sense, this is the science that explains how the stories you're told and the stories you believe end up shaping the experiences you have.
So, Daniel, who are the naive neuroscientists we should be reading, or you enjoy reading, who have helped you make sense of all this, that makes you into what you call what you described yourself as an intellectual turncoat? Adam Phillips, I know, writes extensively about Proust. For people who are interested in the mind and these complexities and dilemmas of the human existence, they'll of course read your book, A Trick of the Mind. But what kind of literature or poetry or cinema or theater should they be also digesting?
I think that, there's lots, but I think the one thing that immediately springs to mind is the work of Jorge Luis Borges.
Yeah, I was thinking Borges, and then he came up in my last conversation too.
Well, there you go.
He not only invented the internet, he invented the brain, right?
Well, quite. And I think that it's sometimes, as maybe you kind of hinted at earlier, there can be something quite humbling about the idea that I can spend months or years trying to refine a particular insight into the human psyche, and I can find it boiled down in a couple of sentences in something by Borges. And I think that that's a kind of nice example of seeing, I think, a continuity between the kinds of questions that artists ask about the human condition and the kinds of things that psychologists should be studying if they're not already.
Yeah, and of course Borges was particularly interested in labyrinths of the mind, I guess, a kind of thought control. Do you agree with him? Is the mind itself sort of a self-perpetuating labyrinth?
I think there's a sense in which the kind of science that I talk about in the book does suggest there's something self-perpetuating about patterns of thought. That in that, it sounds, as you said, like a sort of thought control system, but if you might think, if the opposite of having controlled thoughts is uncontrolled thoughts, I don't like the sound of having uncontrolled thoughts either. And in some sense, what the processes unfolding in your brain do for you is they have the models that you already hold shaping and interpreting the world. And that means there will be a sort of attraction towards the things you already think and thought. That you're not always seeing the world afresh. There's some sense in which the things you already think control your perception of the present. Whether that's a good or bad thing depends on what you already believe. So you can think that some kinds of delusion are going to be you're going to fall prey to certain kinds of delusion if you have the wrong model of the world, and it's going to continue to shape your beliefs in the wrong direction. But if you happen to have a roughly accurate picture of the world you're in and the environment you're trying to understand, you want that control, you want that attraction back to the existing paradigm, because it helps to smooth around the edges of an otherwise noisy and ambiguous environment.
Yeah, the paradox, of course, of Borges when it comes to a picture of the world, that he was a blind librarian. Does being blind, or perhaps having other kinds of physical attributes or lack of attributes, does that change the mind in any way? I mean, the fact that Borges was this weirdly blind librarian surrounded by books. He wasn't literally blind, but he had very poor eyesight. Does that affect the brain? Are our senses existing in parallel, or is it all one big system?
Well, I mean, there's some sense in which, to begin with, your senses are separate, but to have a coherent picture of the world, you have to bring them into alignment. But there's a very long neuroscience literature which has described what different kinds of sensory loss or sensory deprivation might do to the organization of the brain. One thing that I think has been really intriguing recently, though, has been the fact that it seems that even when some kinds of senses might be absent or relatively attenuated, people still seem to be able to get access to certain parts of knowledge and understanding. I mean, there's been some literature in sort of recent years which suggests that even people who are congenitally blind can still tell you which colors are more similar to each other, even though they've never seen them. And that, I don't think, reflects some kind of innate concept of color that we all have. I think it's probably more to do with the way that language allows you to pick out patterns in your environment. That, you know, you might say to me, oh, I like that bluey green shirt you're wearing, but you'll never say, I like that bluey orange shirt. And so from the statistics of language, you can pick up a lot about how the world works. And in that sense, you might not need all your senses to sense everything that's out there.
Perhaps some of these people with bad hearing or bad eyesight are taking psychedelics. In all seriousness, Daniel, we've done a number of shows on psychedelics, on drugs that affect the mind or perception. Is this of value? I mean, there's a whole debate about whether or not psychedelics should be legal. It's not really part of your narrative in A Trick of the Mind, but what's your take on psychedelics? Do they tell us more or less about our brains? I mean, you must have, I assume, down in room 101 in the basement of Birkbeck, you're allowing some of your subjects access to psychedelic drugs.
That sort of thing does indeed go on in our imaging center. I think, I suppose, one of the things that I do contemplate a bit in the book is the idea that motivates a lot of, I think, the current sort of discourse around psychedelic use. You can trace its roots, back to maybe people like Aldous Huxley, or even further back, these ideas from people like Blake, that in some sense the mind is a kind of cage, and to see the world more clearly and to perceive things as they are, you want the doors of perception to be cleansed, right? You want those bars to be removed and to see the world as it really is.
And of course, Huxley was one of the early and I think Blake as well, early experimenters with psychedelics, as well as the author of A Brave New World, in which psychedelics were almost required.
Yeah, and so so Huxley's work, The Laws of Perception, describes his own mescaline trip and how, when he takes the drugs, he feels as though he sees the world with an innocent eye for the first time, as Adam would have done on the day of creation. I mean, he also spends a lot of time describing how he seems to have seen the face of God in the crease of his trousers. So I'm not sure how much we can take his testimony to heart, but I think a kind of common theme here is this idea that you see things clearly only when the preconceptions are lifted. And I think that people report that kind of experience sometimes when they've taken certain psychedelic drugs. But I don't think that that's the right way round. I don't think that if you take away all of the structure that your mind gives you, you see things more clearly. I think you're just put in touch with a world of chaotic, volatile, unstable mystery, and you need those structures to make sense of it. I think that there's a line from William Blake where he says that if the doors of perception were cleansed, the world would appear infinite. And I think that's exactly the problem. If you were in touch with the infinite complexity of the world, it would make no sense to you, and you need this structure from your brain to have any chance of comprehending anything. And I think one way that I think connects to the kind of modern discourse around psychedelics is that there's evidence that some people do seem to have these feelings of insight after having taken the drugs. They have these experiences that are like the ones that Huxley described, of seeing the world afresh for the first time. But I think there's some data that suggests the people who have those experiences were the people who thought they were going to have those experiences beforehand. That in some sense, you're not necessarily having your prison of perception thrown away. You're just having another kind of preconception confirmed, that you believe this drug is going to put you in touch with reality, and lo and behold, you take it and it does.
You can have your prism of reality and eat it. I wonder whether it was coincidental that Huxley, of course, when he was writing this sort of stuff, spent his time and taking this sort of stuff was in Southern California, and looking at a very different world in the desert, often in a very sort of surreal United States. The French theorist of hyperreality, the inventor of the idea of hyperreality, Baudrillard, always talks about the idea of hyperreality and cinema being intrinsically American. Now, you're in London, which isn't America. How does this play into the trick of the mind? Is the reality that our brain invents, is it the same if we're in Edgware or Birkbeck College or the desert of New Mexico?
I think we would expect that in some important ways that it wouldn't all be the same, in that if the experiences of the world around us are what's presented back to us in these kind of theories and predictions, if we inhabit very different worlds, we'll have very different models and we'll therefore expect different things. But one of the things that you mentioned there kind of reminds me of a book by another psychologist, which has come out recently, Presence by Ben Alderson-Day, who's particularly interested in trying to understand when certain kinds of uncanny or surreal experiences happen to certain people. And one case that he spends a lot of time thinking about is the case of polar explorers who go around through these kind of completely featureless, in some sense, very surreal landscapes without, that are sort of desert-like, that don't have the features for our brains to kind of cling onto. And he thinks that it's completely unsurprising that under those kinds of conditions, it's much easier for your brain to project things into the emptiness. That in some sense, we spoke at the beginning of this conversation about the idea of thought and perception as being a sort of duet between the world as it is and the world as you are predicting it to be. And when the world is relatively featureless, you can think that that balance tips much more towards those inner models, making it easier for you to paint that blank canvas with what your mind's already got buried somewhere inside of it.
And that may explain Lawrence of Arabia's different perception, I think, from city people and his understanding of the world in terms of pillars. Finally, Daniel, it's a very interesting conversation. We did a show a couple of days ago with the New York Times writer Matt Richtel, How We Grow Up Understanding Adolescence. He's not a neuroscientist, but he gets into the whole issue of adolescent brains and how they develop. He's actually much more optimistic than a lot of people in America about the development of young people's brains, and certainly the whole huge debate about the impact of social media and smartphones on young people's brains. I'm guessing you might fall into the Richtel camp, a little bit more optimistic than the standard take. You wrote an interesting piece in The New Scientist last month, arguing that our brains become really innovative while we live in a volatile age. In other words, turbulence is good for our brains, and it may even be good for adolescents. So the more smartphones and social media they use, perhaps the more innovative they become.
I think that there's definitely something about uncertainty being neutral, that going through volatile times, it needn't necessarily mean that things are good or bad. All it really means is we don't know what's going to happen next. And one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about in the book and in that piece in The New Scientist is this idea that your brain needs to be alert to when the world is changing, because you want your mind to change when the world is shifting too. And that cannot always be a very comfortable process. It can, the feeling of volatility can be connected to anxiety, but I think it's also connected to the sense of possibility and the sense that things that were true in the past needn't be true in the present or the future. And I think I like the analogy you draw there with adolescence, because one way of thinking about what's happening in the adolescent brain is you're being prepared for a new role in life, that you've had your childhood, you've had a certain kind of experiences, certain sets of ways of understanding the world, and adulthood's going to be different. And so what you need is to have some way of changing those old paradigms and coming up with new ones. And I mean, I was also taken with the idea that this doesn't just happen in adolescence, but it happens at various points throughout our lives when we require the ability to adapt to a new role. So in the book Eve by Kat Bohannon, for example, she talks about a parallel between this kind of turbulence that happens in the mind and brain in adolescence and what happens in what's termed matrescence, when a new mother gives birth to a child. And this idea that you're being prepared for a new way of living and a new way of acting, a new way of thinking and deciding and feeling. And in order to inhabit that new world that you find yourself in, you need to let go of some of your old models and let your brain establish new theories and predictions about what you should be expecting next.
Which is another way of saying perhaps that America is the place of perpetual adolescence, which is why people in their 70s and 80s in airports dress like teenagers, which is probably not a very fair observation, not one that a neuroscientist would make. But finally, Daniel, what does all this tell us about, you mentioned anxiety. We supposedly live, although I'm very skeptical of it, in the age of anxiety. We have certainly an age where therapy and brain illness is very much on the front of our minds, so to speak. It's become an epidemic in some people's minds. What does your book tell us? What does A Trick of the Mind, how the brain invents reality, what does it tell us about the difference between a healthy mind or a healthy brain and an unhealthy one when it comes to this whole issue of anxiety and mental illness?
I think that one of the main insights that the science gives us, and which I crystallize in the book, is that we don't need to think that there's a bright line between being mentally well and mentally unwell, but rather our brain is kind of constantly trying to make sense of the world that it finds itself in. And through exactly the same process that lets people perceive the world healthily, you could sometimes find yourself perceiving it in ways that aren't particularly adaptive. And throughout the book, I talk about various different examples of common psychiatric illnesses, things like depression or anxiety, or things like schizophrenia, or other aspects of neurodiversity like autism. And I describe how you can recast these not as deficits or as illnesses per se, but as differences in the way that your brain is forming models and paradigms to make sense of the particular reality that you inhabit. So in that sense, some kinds of anxiety, some feelings that the world's unstable and unpredictable, those can be perfectly rational beliefs to hold if you find yourself living in a world that's full of unpredictability. And in that sense, you're not unhealthy if you happen to have those thoughts and feelings. They're your brain's way of making sense of the world that it thinks it finds itself in.
Should we use the S word, Daniel? Sanity?
I think that there's something a little problematic about this idea that some people are mad and some people are sane. I think partly because if you take the thread of the book seriously, I would hope it takes you to a place of humility. You start to see that it's not that there are some sane people that see the world as it is, and there are some mad people that see it differently. In some sense, all of us misperceive the world. Some of us misperceive it in a way that's useful to us, in a way that doesn't have too many problems with the way we live our lives. But it's not the case that some people have these preconceptions and these delusions and these biases, and some of us don't. All of us perceive through a filter of our own making, and some of those filters help and some of them harm.
In other words, we're all in the same misperception boat as everyone else, both the naive neuroscientists like myself and the real ones like Daniel. And I'm sure, Daniel, you have your own anxieties, and probably the more anxious and troubled a neuroscientist is, the better a scientist they become. Fascinating conversation. Really interesting, really important in its own profound way. Thank you so much, Daniel, the author of the book. The book is already out in the UK, A Trick of the Mind, How the Brain Invents Your Reality. It's a great read. It will be out in early September in the US. So I would strongly recommend everyone read it. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Andrew.